The locals called him the Iron Shepherd of Detroit, a name whispered at dinner tables and never spoken aloud in open rooms. Marcus Vane was 40 years old, the unchallenged head of the Great Lakes Syndicate, and the most dangerous man in the Midwest. He had a jaw carved from cold steel, eyes that registered nothing, and hands that had done things no priest could absolve. His suits were custom cut in Milan. His shoes cost more than a semester of college tuition, and every man in his organization would walk into traffic if Marcus said the word. But in the velvet-curtained world of organized crime, a world where bloodlines were currency and heirs were proof of dominance, Marcus Vane operated under a silent, devastating asterisk. He was infertile 3 years prior. A failed assassination orchestrated by the Varro family had left Marcus with 4 bullets in his lower abdomen. He had survived, as Marcus always survived, through sheer terrifying will. But the surgeons at Northwestern had pulled his lead physician aside in the hallway and delivered the verdict in low, careful tones. The damage was permanent. He would never father a biological child. In the syndicate world, this was a catastrophe of almost political proportions. The powerful crime families of the Midwest, the Beneventi clan in Indianapolis, the Drago network in Cleveland, the Caruso empire in Pittsburgh all quietly closed the door on any marriage alliance with Marcus. Their daughters were assets. Assets were not squandered on dead-end dynasties, and Marcus, notorious for his cruelty and his total refusal to be managed, had zero interest in the brittle, calculating women paraded before him like livestock at auction. He needed a wife. The Eastern Commission, the governing council that oversaw the entire Mid-Atlantic and Great Lakes criminal infrastructure, was demanding he present a stable family image at their upcoming winter summit in New York. A boss without roots, without a family table to sit at, was a boss under scrutiny. Marcus had been stalling for 8 months. He was running out of time, 40 miles south, in a third-floor walk-up on the east side of Dearborn. 31-year-old Nora Callahan was calculating how many hours she needed to work before the electricity company stopped being patient. Nora was not connected to any underworld. She was a line cook at a 24-hour breakfast spot called the Iron Skillet, pulling back-to-back shifts 6 days a week to support her 6-year-old daughter, Rosie. Nora was a tall, full-figured woman, wide-hipped, broad-shouldered, with strong hands and a laugh that could fill a room when she let it out, which wasn't often anymore. Life had spent several years sanding down her joy. She'd grown up wearing clothes, 2 sizes too large, absorbing the quiet cruelty of a world that treated big women as inconveniences. Her mother told her she'd look prettier if she tried harder. Boys at school had made her the punchline of jokes she memorized against her will. She'd learned to make herself small, to shrink into corners, to take up as little space as possible. A brutal irony for a woman who physically could not. Her ex-boyfriend, Derek Shaw, had been exactly the kind of man she should have run from on sight. Charming, slippery, and allergic to accountability. He had given her Rosie, the one genuinely perfect thing in Nora's life, and then vanished into a spiral of sports, gambling, and bad decisions, leaving behind a daughter he never called and a debt Nora hadn't known existed. $82,000 owed to the Vane Syndicate. Derek had borrowed against Nora's name without her knowledge. He'd forged her signature on a debt agreement as a guarantor. And then, like smoke, he'd simply ceased to exist in her life, leaving the bill behind, like an unwanted houseguest. The syndicate didn't care about forgeries. They cared about consequences. They came for her on a Thursday evening in February, when the temperature had dropped below zero, and Rosie was asleep in the back seat of Nora's rusted Pontiac Sunfire in the restaurant parking lot. Two men, in cashmere overcoats, sprawled, unhurried, politely terrifying, stepped out of a black Escalade and positioned themselves on either side of her before she could reach the driver's door. Ms. Callahan. The taller one had a voice like gravel under a boot heel. His name was Decker. Mr. Vane would like a word. Nora looked at her sleeping daughter through the cracked car window. Her heart hammered. She had no illusions about what this was. My daughter stays in the car, Nora said. She'll be watched over. You have my word. She had no way to know if that word meant anything, but she had no choice. Either. They drove her to a property she hadn't known existed, a sprawling stone estate on the private north shore of Lake St. Clair, set back behind iron gates and old-growth oak trees. The kind of house that didn't appear on any map, because the owner didn't want it to. Inside, the ceilings were 15 feet high. The foyer floor was Italian travertine. Every surface whispered money so old, it had stopped needing to announce itself. Nora clutched her canvas work bag to her chest and kept her eyes straight ahead. Marcus Vane was standing when they brought her into his study. He hadn't sat down to receive her because sitting down was a gesture of welcome, and he hadn't decided yet if she warranted one. He stood beside a mahogany desk the size of a life raft, hands clasped behind his back, watching her, the way a man watches something unexpected fall from a great height. He had expected weeping, frantic bargaining, the hollow-eyed desperation of a woman who knew she was outnumbered and outgunned. Instead, Nora Callahan walked in with her chin up. She was trembling. He could see that. Her fingers were white around the strap of her bag, but her jaw was set, and her brown eyes swept the room with a wariness that wasn't cowardice. It was calculation. She was assessing exits. She was doing math. I didn't sign anything, Nora said. Before he could speak, her voice shook slightly, but it carried. Derek Shaw forged my name. I've never borrowed money in my life. I make $14 an hour, and I'm raising a child alone. So, whatever you think you're collecting on it doesn't exist. Marcus studied her in silence. She was a big woman, full-figured, with thick arms and a heavy frame that made no apologies for itself. Her hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and she smelled faintly of breakfast, grease, and dish soap. There was nothing manufactured about her. No performance. No angle. Just a woman stating a fact and daring him to contradict it. I'm aware Derek Shaw is the original debtor, Marcus said. His voice was quiet and completely controlled. He is no longer findable. In my business, Ms. Callahan. Debts are transferable. Then your business is barbaric. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. But she didn't back down. Killing me doesn't get you anything. I have nothing. But I can work. I can cook, clean, whatever you need. Just let me raise my daughter. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The Eastern Commission Summit was 11 weeks away. He needed a wife. He needed a child to present as a ward and heir in practice, if not in biology. He looked at Nora Callahan, who was prepared to scrub his floors to save her daughter's life, and felt something shift in the architecture of his thinking. You won't be cleaning anything, Marcus said, walking slowly around the desk until he stood close enough that she had to look up at him. You're going to marry me. The color drained from Nora's face. She took one step back and hit the door with her shoulder blades. "It's a contract," Marcus clarified, his tone stripped of any warmth, purely transactional. "You marry me. You and your daughter move here. In public. You are my wife. In private. You maintain your own life, in your own wing of this house. In exchange, the debt disappears entirely. Your daughter attends whatever school she chooses. You receive a monthly allowance, full household staff support, and at the end of 2 years, a settlement of $1.2 million, a clean exit, and a new life anywhere you want it." Nora stared at him. The rumors she'd heard whispered between late-night diner regulars painted Marcus Vane as something barely human. A man who'd once sent a rival's entire operation to the bottom of Lake Erie over a scheduling dispute. She thought about Rosie, about the disconnection notice on the refrigerator, about Derek's debt, and what the alternative to this arrangement looked like. "You do not touch my daughter," Nora said. Not a hand raised. Not a harsh word. Nothing. She is not part of any deal. She is protected under my name, from this moment forward. Marcus replied. "Nothing touches her. And you don't touch me either." Something flickered behind his eyes. Separate wings. Separate lives. Clear. Nora exhaled slowly. "Deal." The ceremony took place 3 days later in the living room of a federal judge who owed Marcus Vane a significant favor. There were no flowers, no guests, just 2 witnesses, a notary, and Rosie sitting in a velvet armchair, eating a granola bar and watching with wide, untroubled eyes. Because 6-year-olds are remarkably adaptable, the relocation was immediate. For Nora, the shift was almost physically disorienting. She went from a drafty apartment where the hot water ran out every morning to a 16-room estate with a chef's kitchen, a private garden, and a bathroom larger than her former living room. A team of personal shoppers arrived within 48 hours with clothes not the shapeless, apologetic fabrics Nora had spent her whole life hiding inside, but structured, tailored pieces that fit her actual body, silk blouses that curved over her hips, wide-leg trousers in charcoal and cream, a wool coat that made her look like she owned the sidewalk she stood on. She barely recognized herself in the mirror, but she knew what she was. A convenience. A prop. A woman Marcus Vane had acquired the way other men acquired office furniture, because the situation demanded it and the timing was right. She repeated this to herself regularly. Like a warning she was afraid she'd forget. Marcus, meanwhile, was adjusting to something he had no vocabulary for, the presence of a child in his house who was completely indifferent to his reputation. Rosie had discovered the library on her second morning in the estate and had arranged his first edition collection into what she described as a better order. Marcus stood in the doorway watching her for 4 full minutes before silently retreating without comment. At breakfast, she climbed into the chair across from him without being invited, ate her oatmeal with total confidence, and informed him that his house smelled like an old bank. He ate breakfast in the kitchen every morning after that, and he told himself it had nothing to do with the fact that Nora sat at the far end of the table every morning, looking like something that belonged in natural light. He watched the way she moved around a kitchen, certain efficient, her full hips swaying in an unhurried rhythm, her hands always doing 2 things at once. She'd begun cooking for the household staff, quietly, without being asked, because she'd noticed the food they were being served was institutional. One evening, Marcus came downstairs at midnight because he couldn't sleep, and found her making chicken and dumplings from scratch in his professional kitchen, barefoot in silk pajamas, singing something low and tuneless to herself. She heard him and went still. "I was going to clean it up," she said quickly. "I know." He sat down at the kitchen island without invitation. "Is there enough?" She looked at him for a long, searching moment. Then she got a bowl. They ate in silence for a while. And then she asked him, quietly, with no pressure behind it, if he was all right. Not what was wrong. Not what happened. Just whether he was okay. Nobody in Marcus Vane's life asked him that. Not ever. He didn't answer. But he came back to the kitchen the following Friday night. And the one after that. The winter summit was held at the Meridian Grand Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. It was Nora's first public appearance as Mrs. Marcus Vane. She wore a midnight blue gown with a deep neckline and structured skirt that fell in heavy, dramatic folds over her full figure. Her hair was pinned back with 2 Art Deco clips. She wore small diamond earrings and nothing else. The stylist had tried to add more jewelry. Nora had declined with polite finality. She looked magnificent, but walking through those hotel doors, with her hand on Marcus's arm, every insecurity she'd spent her adult life managing rushed her at once. She could feel the eyes, the assessments, the slow, deliberate cataloguing of her body by people who'd spent their lives in rooms where the only women who mattered were decorative and deliberately thin. She began, instinctively, to pull inward. The old habit, the disappearing act. Marcus's hand closed over hers on his forearm, eyes forward. He murmured, his mouth barely moving. "You walk like you own the floor." "Because you do." She didn't know if she believed it, but she straightened her shoulders. The insult came 40 minutes in. A captain from the Varro faction, a thick-necked man named Sal Greco, who smelled of bourbon and overconfidence, materialized beside them at the bar and let his gaze travel over Nora with the unhurried contempt of a man who'd never been made to feel consequences. "Vane, heard you finally made it official." He tilted his bourbon glass in Nora's direction. "Didn't figure you for a man who'd go bargain shopping. What happened? Ran out of options? Or just ran out of standards?" The room temperature dropped. Nora's face burned. She felt her stomach clench with that old, corrosive shame, the kind that had been poured into her since childhood, that told her she was too much and not enough simultaneously. She started to take a step back. Marcus's hand shot out with terrifying speed and wrapped around Sal Greco's collar. And before Sal's own bodyguards could process the motion, Marcus had him bent backward over the bar. Bottles, rattling. Ice, scattering across the mahogany. "Apologize to my wife." Marcus's voice was barely above a murmur. That was the part that made everyone in the room hold their breath. Not the violence, but the quiet. "Right now. So I'll use her name. And if I see your face within 20 feet of her for the rest of the night, I will make certain the next summit you attend is the one where your replacement is announced." Sal apologized. Twice. His voice came out ragged and small. Marcus released him, adjusted his lapels, and offered Nora his arm again, as if nothing had happened. "Ready?" he asked her. She took his arm, and for the first time, in longer than she could measure, Nora Callahan did not look at the floor when she walked into a room. That night, back at the hotel, she knocked on the door between their adjoining suites. Marcus opened it looking tired. Jacket off, jaw dark with stubble. She didn't say anything. She just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his midsection. pressing her face against his chest. This solid, dangerous, bewildering man who had, for reasons she didn't fully understand yet, decided that she mattered. He went rigid. The man was unaccustomed to softness. It landed on him like an unfamiliar language. Then, slowly, his arms came up around her. His face dropped to her hair. "Thank you," she said into his shirt. "Don't mention it." His voice was rough. "I mean that. Don't tell anyone." She laughed, surprised out of it. Helpless, and felt him exhale into her curls, like something was releasing pressure he'd been holding for a long time. The weeks that followed were the most disorienting of Nora's life. She had agreed to a transaction. She was watching it become something else entirely. Against every warning she issued herself, Marcus brought her coffee in the morning without being asked, black, with 1 sugar. Because he'd noticed, he asked about Rosie's school projects with a specificity that indicated he'd actually listened to previous answers. He had a ridiculous, bone-dry sense of humor that emerged only when no one else was watching. And it undid her completely. And then the past arrived. Armed and purposeful, it happened on a Tuesday in March. 6 weeks into their arrangement, Nora was picking Rosie up from her new school in the estate's SUV. One of Marcus's men, a quiet, watchful guy named Torres, in the driver's seat. They were pulling out of the school lot when a gray cargo van accelerated from the curb and blocked them in. Torres reached for his radio and was hit across the temple before he could call it in. The side door of the van slid open. Derek Shaw stepped out. He was wearing a suit Nora didn't recognize and a smile she remembered from every bad moment of the last 7 years. Behind him, in the van's shadow, she could make out the shape of an older man leaning on a cane, narrow-shouldered, patient, radiating the particular menace of someone who had long ago stopped needing to rush anything. That was Emilio Varro, the man whose family Marcus had been at war with for the better part of a decade. "Hey, Nora." Derek's voice was light and awful. "Miss me." The abandoned shipping warehouse in River Rouge smelled of rust and river water. Nora landed on the concrete floor and rolled, covering Rosie immediately with her body. "Don't you touch her," Nora said. Her voice was steady in a way that shocked her. Emilio Varro settled into a camp chair that had been set up in the middle of the floor, the kind of casual cruelty that came from a man who treated every location like his living room. He regarded Nora with the mild distaste of someone examining something stuck to their shoe. So this is what Vane chose. Emilio's voice was dry. "Remarkable. The great Iron Shepherd of Detroit. Domesticated by a line cook." Derek was pacing, buzzing with nervous energy, the unmistakable frequency of a man who owed debts to multiple parties and was betting everything on this one play. "Here's the thing, Nora," Derek said. "Turns out being connected to Marcus Vane makes you valuable. Who knew?" "Right. All that time I spent thinking you were a dead end." He laughed, and the sound of it tightened something in her chest. "Funny how that works." Emilio produced a phone and dialed 10 miles away. In the war room of his estate, Marcus picked up on the first ring. He said nothing. "Mr. Vane." Emilio's voice filled the room. "I have your wife and the child. The Dearborn shipping corridor transfers to my family by midnight. You step back from your Eastern Commission seat, or I let the ex-boyfriend here handle his loose ends and send your household arrangement back to you in portions." The silence on the line lasted 4 seconds. When Marcus spoke, his voice was so controlled it sounded like it had been refrigerated. "Emilio," he said, "you've made an error in your analysis of my situation. You assumed that because I cannot produce an heir biologically, I have nothing I would burn the world to protect. A pauser. You were wrong. Keep the line open. 40 seconds later, an explosion shook the city's south end. Emilio's secondary safe house, his backup. His insurance detonated with architectural completeness through the phone speaker. Emilio heard his own men screaming, "Your distribution hub. On Gratiot." Marcus continued, his voice unchanged. "My people are there right now. Tell me where my family is in the next 30 seconds. Or I work through your real estate holdings from west to east until there's nothing left but parking lots." Emilio Varro. For possibly the first time in 40 years of organized crime, looked afraid in the warehouse. Derek read the room. He read it wrong. Forget the plan. Derek said, pulling a snub-nosed revolver from his waistband and pointing it at Nora. "We kill them, and we run." Simple. Nora didn't think. She reacted from somewhere beneath thought, from the part of her that was entirely and only a mother. She lunged upward from the floor, driving her full weight into Derek's center of mass, shoulder first. He hadn't accounted for her size. Hermas. The physics of her. The impact drove the air out of him and sent them both crashing backward into a rusted shelving unit. The gun discharged into the ceiling with a crack that rang through the entire building. Derek hit the floor, clutching his ribs. Nora scrambled for the weapon. One of Varro's men grabbed her by the arm and spun her backward. She hit the concrete wall with her shoulder and slid down it. Then the warehouse doors exploded inward, not metaphorically. The vehicle that breached the eastern loading bay at 40 miles per hour took the entire door frame with it, raining corrugated steel and concrete across the floor. A matte black SUV with no plates came to a shrieking halt 20 feet inside. Marcus stepped out of the passenger side before the car stopped rolling. He was carrying a tactical rifle and wearing a three-piece suit. And he looked like something that had walked out of a nightmare, wearing expensive fabric. His men flooded the building behind him. 8 of them. Professional. Fast. Coordinated. And the Varro soldiers, already shaken by the news from their safe house, made a series of rapid, sensible decisions about their own survival. The exchange was brief. Emilio Varro attempted to exit through a rear access door. Marcus shot him in the right knee with a precision that suggested he'd thought carefully about exactly how much damage to cause. Emilio went down like a controlled demolition. Marcus stepped over him without stopping and swept the building with his eyes until he found Nora. She was in the far corner, her arms completely around Rosie, the little girl's face buried in her mother's neck. Nora's dress was torn at the shoulder, and she had a cut on her cheek from the wall. Marcus's rifle hit the floor. He crossed the warehouse in 12 strides and dropped to his knees on the concrete in front of them. And for the first time in the memory of every man present, Marcus Vane's hands were shaking. Nora. His voice broke apart on the single syllable, "We're okay." Her arms went around his shoulders immediately, pulling him in, anchoring him. "Hey, look at me. We're okay. Rosie's okay." He pressed his face into her neck and stayed there for a long moment, his arms coming around both of them, enormous and shaking. From across the warehouse, a wet groan indicated that Derek Shaw was attempting to crawl toward the breach in the wall. Marcus lifted his head. The shaking stopped. His face reassembled into something cold and absolute. "Deca," he said quietly. "Take my wife and daughter to the car." "No." Marcus turned to look at Nora. She was already standing. Her dress was torn. Her hair had half escaped its pins, and she had blood on her cheek. She stood in the middle of a Detroit warehouse at 2 in the morning and took up every inch of space she occupied with total, deliberate intention. She looked at Derek Shaw, the man who had taken years from her, humiliated her, used her name without permission, and just tried to end her life. "You don't crawl away from this," Nora said. Her voice carried across the whole building. "You ran from every consequence, your entire life. Not tonight." She looked at Marcus. "Hen-lid," she said, "but take your time." Marcus smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the smile of a man who had just discovered exactly who he had married, and found it to be far more than he'd bargained for in all the best ways. "Yes, Ma'am," he said softly. 3 weeks later, the Eastern Commission's Winter Summit convened in New York. The room was all dark wood and older money. 12 men around an oval table who collectively governed the criminal infrastructure of the eastern half of the country. At the head sat Raymond Albright. The commission's chair, a 70-year-old man from Philadelphia who had survived everything the last half-century had thrown at him through a combination of patience and absolute ruthlessness. Marcus sat with Nora beside him. She wore a structured burgundy suit with wide lapels and a pencil skirt. And she looked at the men in that room the way you look at something you're deciding whether to bother with. The diamond on her hand was new. Marcus had placed it there that morning without ceremony. Quietly. In the kitchen. Which felt right. Raymond Albright opened proceedings by noting the obvious. "The Varro network is in critical condition," he said, "which is convenient for you, Vane, and inconvenient for our stability. There are also lingering questions about your succession line. You know the Commission's position on legacy." "I know it," Marcus said. He stood and nodded toward the room's side entrance. Decker opened the door. Rosie walked in, wearing a tartan dress and patent leather shoes, holding a crayon drawing she'd made in the car, a family of 3 stick figures in front of a very large house. Labeled in her careful 6-year-old print, "Our House." She crossed the room and handed it to Marcus without any indication that she found a room full of crime bosses remarkable in any way. Marcus held it up. "Bloodline," Raymond Albright said carefully, "is the Commission's standard. Blood is biology." Marcus replied, "Legacy is choice." He set the drawing on the table between them and met Raymond's eyes directly. "This child carries my name, my protection, and my sworn word. I have held this network together for 11 years without a family and built it into something none of you could dismantle. Now I have a family." He paused. "The man who wants to debate the biology of it can meet me outside. But bring extra people. Because I had a good week." The silence stretched. Raymond Albright looked at the drawing, looked at Nora, who was watching him with the composed, unhurried expression of a woman who had already been through worse than this room, looked at Marcus. The Commission recognizes Rosie Vane as the acknowledged heir to the Great Lakes Syndicate. Raymond said, "Sit down, Marcus." That night, standing at the window of their hotel suite, overlooking the grid of Manhattan, sparkling 40 floors below, Marcus stood behind Nora, with his arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on the top of her head. "You know," he said, "half those men were terrified of you, and they hadn't even spoken to you." Nora looked out at the city. "Good." He turned her around slowly. In the window light, with her hair down and the suit jacket over the chair, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had survived everything that had been thrown at her and come out the other side, not diminished, but expanded, I don't want 2 years, Marcus said. She looked at him. I want the rest of it. He said, plain as anything. All of it. The kitchen, at midnight. The arguments. The child who reorganized my library. All of it. Nora was quiet for a moment. You know what they'll say. She said, the ones who still think I don't belong here. Let them. He cupped her face in his hands. These hands that had done terrible things and were holding her like she was the most breakable and most important thing he'd ever touched. You walked into my house with nothing and turned it into a home. You raised a daughter who has more integrity than every man in that boardroom. And you faced down armed men in a warehouse and came out giving orders. He pressed his forehead to hers. Tell me who doesn't belong. Nora. I'll make time. She laughed that full, room-filling laugh. She'd spent years shrinking, and she let him pull her in, outside. Manhattan burned, with its 10,000 lights, and inside that room, quietly and entirely without permission. The Iron Shepherd of Detroit fell in love with the woman who'd had the nerve to walk into his world and refused to disappear. She had come in owing a debt that wasn't hers. She left carrying an empire that was